One of the most immediately distinguishable British trains ever built, the Class 91s and their rakes of Mark IV coaches were perhaps the last stand for British Rail's ability to deliver innovation on a restricted state subsidy. These 140-mile-an-hour capable express sets, built for the premier Flying Scotsman service from London King's Cross, revolutionised this vital corridor through speed and comfort that was tailor-made for the 1990s and will provide the backbone for East Coast operations for the next 30 years. The construction of the Class 91s and their Mark IV coaching stock is owed entirely to the electrification of the East Coast Main Line, the premier route between London King's Cross, Peterborough, Doncaster, Leeds, York, Newcastle and Edinburgh. Proposals to electrify the line had been mooted as far back as the early 1950s, when the British Rail Board considered an early modernisation plan to see all mainline routes out of London electrified in a manner similar to what was being adopted in Europe. However, due to pushback from the British Transport Commission, or BTC, an arm of the government responsible for managing the nationalised transport assets of the British state, this ambitious proposal was pruned down to only the West Coast and Southeastern main lines being electrified under the finalised modernisation plan of 1955. One of the main factors as to the East Coast main line failing to see electrification was the expense of modifying the famous barrel roof at King's Cross Station to accommodate the overhead wires. Instead, steam traction on the East Coast was replaced by high-speed diesel power during 1961 in the form of the Type 5 Deltics, later designated Class 55s, the first diesel locomotives to achieve a sustained 100 miles an hour in the UK, and ones that, despite their somewhat unique nature and complex mechanics, would ply their merry trade upon the premier route from London to Edinburgh for the next 20 years. During the 1970s, small-scale electrification projects were introduced on the southern end of the East Coast Main Line for commuter services as far as Hitchin, while the Deltics were eventually replaced by the 125-mile-an-hour high-speed trains from 1977, which introduced a revolution in speed and comfort for the Flying Scotsman run to northern England and Scotland, as well as named trains beyond Edinburgh to Aberdeen and Inverness. The matter of introducing a potential rolling electrification scheme upon the network was still a hotly debated topic for British Rail, as with the success of overhead electric traction on the West Coast Main Line, which brought about the creation of the famous Class 87s for Royal Scots services between London Euston and Glasgow Central, the expectation was that electrification could still be delivered for the East Coast Main Line. This was encouraged by the potential success of the Advanced Passenger Train, or APT, an experimental tilting train that was the first of its kind to adopt an active tilting mechanism of hydraulics and mechanical arms rather than the passive system of the Spanish Talgo and Canadian UAC turbo train. However, the prospects of the APT, after a rigorous testing and a controversial early entry into passenger service that ended in humiliation for British Rail, was the axing of the entire project in 1986, just as it was on the cusp of successfully overcoming its technical gremlins, though despite the collapse of the APT scheme, electrification of the East Coast Main Line remained on the cards, and a new form of traction needed to be considered in order to power the future electric service. Initially, British Rail considered three options: a six-axle, 125-mile-an-hour capable electric locomotive, the creation of electric-powered Class 43s from the high-speed train, or a four-axle, lightweight streamlined locomotive that was capable of 140 miles an hour and would be semi-permanently coupled to a rake of matching stock and a cab control car in a manner similar to the proposed production sets of the failed APT concept. The six-axle locomotive concept ultimately came to fruition in 1986 as Brush Traction's Class 89 prototype, while the proposal to create electrically powered HST sets was dropped due to a demand by British Rail that the new traction unit should be capable for use at night hauling freight and parcels trains. The runoff between the Class 89 and the 140-mile-an-hour proposal of GEC Transportation, dubbed the Class 91, eventually came down to its ability to operate at higher speeds should a successful tilting mechanism be developed, something to which the Class 89 was not able to achieve due to its heavier and more conventional design, thus meaning the Class 91, alongside its new coaching stock, was chosen for further development. Subsequently, a £35 million contract was signed in February 1986 for a fleet of 31 locomotives that would be assembled by British Rail Engineering Limited at their Crewe works, with the option for a further 25 examples to be built for the West Coast Main Line based on the success of the initial batch. Alongside the Class 91s, Each locomotive would be delivered with a rake of 9 passenger coaches and a cab control car at the rear, dubbed a driving van trailer or DVT, which would come under the designation of Class 82, the DVT being one of 2 variants developed during this period, the others being for the West Coast Main Line out of London Euston. The coaches and DVTs, which were allocated as Mark IV stock, were of a narrower tapered profile, designed specifically for the possibility of incorporating a tilting mechanism after entry into service, thus accommodating the tighter clearances between passing trains when at full tilt, though in the end the tilting mechanism was never fitted to the Mark IV coaches or the Class 91s. Construction of the locomotives, as mentioned, was undertaken at BREL's Crew Works alongside the upcoming Class 90s for the West Coast Main Line, and proved to be the last designs to be assembled at the near 150-year-old facility of Grand Junction Railway Heritage, while the coaches were assembled at Metro Camel's Washwood Heath plant near Birmingham. For the Class 91s themselves, these trains incorporated a number of revolutionary features that had not been seen before in a British locomotive, and included a pioneering effort to reduce the unsprung mass and potential damage to the trackwork through hammer blow effect by having the motors mounted in the body, with the axles being driven via cardan shafts. Meanwhile, the main transformer was underslung rather than being within the main body, and the propulsion system incorporated the latest electronic control. Another unique aspect of the Class 91s being their body shell design, so as to make them a usable independent locomotive, rather than being solely fixed to a Mark IV set with no other possible function. This came to pass in the form of a streamlined cab at one end and a flat-fronted or blunt cab at the other, meaning the locomotive could be driven from both ends when operating on non-passenger deployment, the Class 91s being capable of achieving 6,480 horsepower, which made them twice as powerful as the Class 55 Deltics and were capable of reaching an absolute top speed of 140 miles an hour. With the design finalised, work progressed quickly, and on February 12, 1988, exactly 2 years to the day since the order was placed, the first Class 91001 was released from the Crew Works, all while electrification of the East Coast Main Line from Hitchin to Edinburgh and Leeds was undertaken at pace, with Leeds being reached during 1988, York in 1989, and the full route to Edinburgh in 1991. British Rail would put the first 10 Class 91s into service from 1988, immediately following their completion, so as to begin extensive testing on the energised section between London and Leeds, though a number of teething troubles, particularly with the electronics, began to emerge, and although 91001 to 91005 were all available by mid-April, these caused the proposed service launch, which had been planned for the start of the May timetable, to be postponed. Each locomotive would continue to see heavy testing to amass 10,000 miles of operation, and were proven to run at up to 150 miles an hour, with one engine, 91110 Northern Rock, achieving a record for fastest locomotive in Britain with a top speed of 162 miles an hour, while descending Stoke Bank with a short rake of Mark IV coaches on September 17, 1989, 51 years after LNER A4 Pacific 4468 Mallard set the world speed record for steam locomotives at the same location. By August 1988, the first Class 91 managed to reach Leeds, but by then officials were saying that the new class was still not reliable enough for use in everyday service, with microprocessors supplied by GEC, among other things, being singled out for blame, the technical gremlins with the Class 91s seeing rectification work be undertaken until the spring of 1989, after which these problems were largely ironed out. The first revenue-earning service hauled by a Class 91 was undertaken on March 3rd, with 91001 running a King's Cross to Peterborough semi-fast diagram, further low-key introductions taking place over the following days, with the first Class 91 passenger diagram to Leeds being conducted on March 11th in the hands of 91008, although much of the electrified network had already been covered since 1988 in revenue service by the unique Class 89 prototype 89001, which worked briefly alongside the Class 91s. Other locomotives, meanwhile, continued to undergo tests, including 91009 running over Beatock Summit in southern Scotland on the West Coast Main Line with a rake of coaches at the end of April 1989. However, while the Class 91s were gradually entering service, delays in the construction and testing of the Mark IV trailers and DVTs meant revenue work for the locomotives had to be conducted with older Mark III coaches from the high-speed train, while in order to provide a suitable DVT surrogate, 8 Class 43 power cars from the regular East Coast Main Line HST pool were converted for use with the Class 91s through the removing of their lower balancing in favour of buffers. This was coupled to the temporary fitting of special remote control equipment that allowed the engines to be powered by the electric at the other end of the train while being propelled. Power cars 43013, 014, 065, 067, 068, 080, 084, and 123 receiving this treatment, and worked alongside both Class 91s and the unique Class 89 for both testing and passenger operation until the first full Mark IV sets became available during 1989 and 1990. After this, the HST power cars were returned to regular operation and their remote control systems removed, although during their service with the Class 91s, the combined output of the Class 43s and the electrics made them among the most powerful express trains in Britain, as due to oil fire concerns caused by the Class 43s idling for extended periods of time, they were in fact used to assist in acceleration of the sets, giving the Class 91s an extra boost when departing stations. Eventually, the full electric timetable between London and Edinburgh was completed in 1991, just as the final Class 91, 91031, entered service, these sets being originally marketed as Electras, but were soon dubbed the InterCity 225, as a logical continuation of the theme started by the InterCity 125s 15 years earlier. However, the use of 225 km an hour, as an equivalent to the locomotive's 140 mile-an-hour top speed, caused some consternation as to the employment of the metric system on a British train, while at the same time giving a somewhat exaggerated view of the train's performance if read in miles per hour like the InterCity 125s, as this would essentially mean the Electras were capable of reaching speeds faster than the French TGV, the Ice Train of Germany, and the Shinkansen of Japan. The reality was that, while the Class 91s were able to achieve 140 miles an hour and more under testing, a lack of investment in updated signalling to warrant higher speeds, as well as the abandonment of potentially incorporating a tilt mechanism into the Mark IV sets, meant these trains, at most, only ever achieved 125 miles an hour in regular operation. Nevertheless, the Class 91s were soon working an intensive series of diagrams that saw these sets covering over 1,000 miles per average weekday, although their proposed non-passenger work failed to materialise, as did attempts to introduce the sets onto the West Coast main line out of London Euston. This was a result of restricted funding by the incumbent Conservative government of John Major in the wake of the 1992 economic recession, during which the provision of state subsidies to the various sectors of British Rail was strictly controlled, with InterCity desperately seeking to introduce a further 25 Class 91s and Mark IV sets for West Coast work out of London Euston, while Network South East desired funding to bring the Class 365, 465 and 466 networker commuter trains to fruition. A competition was subsequently held between the two firms, so as to curry favour with the state, InterCity dispatching 91001 to undertake stakeholder specials from London Euston to Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool and Carlisle during the summer of 1993. Ultimately, the inability of the trains to yield notable improvements to journey times due to their lack of a tilting mechanism, together with the recent introduction of Class 90s and the prospect of the ill-fated InterCity 250 project, hoping to see a thoroughly modern, tilt-capable series of train sets introduced on the West Coast main line, saw the InterCity 225 never used on its intended work for trains out of London Euston, with the subsidy eventually being awarded to Network South East for their networker project, the East Coast main line being the only enclave for Electra operation throughout their revenue-earning careers. More worrying, though, was the reliability of these machines, a pervasive issue that was traced to the substandard electronics, causing a substantial number of failures, particularly relay faults, especially when passing through sections of neutral catenary, efforts to improve the mechanical fidelity of the Class 91s unfortunately not being undertaken during the tenure of InterCity, as following the start of privatisation during 1994, the Class 91s were transferred to the ownership of Eversholt Rail. Meanwhile, operation of the InterCity East Coast franchise was awarded to Sea Containers of Bermuda, who created a new private service provider in the form of the Great North Eastern Railway, or GNER, which adopted a sleek dark blue and orange livery while incorporating an image that harkened back to the days of the classic LNER of the 1920s and 30s. However, an imperative of GNER was to improve the reliability of the Class 91s, and thus in conjunction with Eversholt Rail, an upgrade program was undertaken that saw extensive improvements to compressors, parking brakes and electrical components, the fitting of train protection warning systems, and a revised gearbox, with upgraded locomotives being released back into traffic, with their original number increased by 100, an example being 91001 being renumbered to 91101. The shortfall in Class 91s caused by the refurbishment of the fleet between 1997 and 2001 required various forms of traction to be drafted in to fill the gap, including Class 90s hired in from Rail Freight Distribution and later EWS, with one example, 90024, even receiving GNER's corporate livery. Other examples included the brief subleasing of Class 321 commuter units from Arriva Trains Northern in June 1998 for use on certain Leeds to London diagrams, the reinstatement of the unique Class 89 into operational service following its withdrawal after a major failure in 1992, and the hiring of several 14-car Class 373 sets from London and Continental Railways from May 2000 to work diagrams between London, Leeds and York. Nevertheless, the modifications to the Class 91s increased their availability while ironing out their endemic design flaws, thus making them among the most reliable locomotives at work in the UK. Sadly, with privatisation came problems for the wider operation of the rail system, particularly with regard to maintenance of the permanent way, GNER and its Class 91s bearing the brunt of this on October 17, 2000, when due to a broken rail, the northbound 1210 London to Leeds service, as hauled by 91023 City of Durham, was derailed south of Hatfield Station while travelling at 125 miles an hour. This caused the carriages to tumble into a heap on the outside of a long sweeping curve, while the buffet carriage struck an overhead catenary pole and was crushed, leading to the deaths of 4 people and the injury of over 70, the accident revealing a disturbing flaw in the maintenance of infrastructure by the newly privatised railway upkeep firm Railtrack, who had subcontracted repairs to this section of track to Balfour Beatty. The subsequent litigation of this incident saw both firms found guilty of breaching health and safety laws, while across the UK network, a blanket cap on speed limits of 100 miles an hour was implemented, as the network was thoroughly inspected for any other potential flaws in the trackwork. 4 months later, though, the InterCity 225 sets will be back in the news for tragic reasons, as on February 28, 2001, a southbound GNER service from Newcastle to London, as led by DBT number 82221 and propelled again by 91023 City of Durham, struck a Land Rover Defender hauling a trailer on which was sat a Renault Savannah estate car that had tumbled down the embankment from the M62 motorway due to the driver having fallen asleep at the wheel. Attempts to notify Railtrack of the obstruction by the driver sadly came too late, and the car and trailer were struck by the southbound express at over 100 miles an hour, causing a derailment that slewed the DBT and coaches into the path of a northbound loaded coal train hauled by a Freightliner Class 66, obliterating the DBT, sending the carriages crashing across the adjacent field, and throwing the freight locomotive into the garden of a nearby house. The death toll of the Great Heck derailment eventually came to 10 killed and 82 injured, although the Class 91, 91023, was derailed but undamaged by the incident, being returned to work as 91132 after refurbishment, so as to distance the machine from its unfortunate history of accidents. Regardless of the InterCity 225s being involved in 2 of Britain's most severe modern rail accidents, these trains continue to ply their trade on the East Coast Main Line through the GNER era and into the National Express East Coast franchise following GNER's demise in 2007. However, due to National Express's inability to meet the financial requirements of their franchise agreement, only one Class 91, 91111, was ever painted into their corporate grey and white before they handed back the franchise in late 2009, with East Coast Trains, as operated by the Department for Transport, moving in to run services out of King's Cross until 2015. During that year, the InterCity East Coast franchise was returned to the private sector under Virgin Trains East Coast, though this too, in the face of being unable to meet its financial obligations, was forced to have its franchise tenure cut short when the government once again moved in to seize control, this time under operator of last resort, London and North Eastern Railway or LNER, which was formed in 2018 and maintained Virgin's previous livery of red and white. Under the franchise commitments of Virgin Trains, though, the Class 91s, together with the HSTs, were to be replaced by a new fleet of bi-mode express trains dubbed the Azuma, which would come to pass as the Class 800 and 801 units built by Hitachi, which can operate in both electric and diesel configuration. The commitments of Virgin were maintained under LNER, with the first Class 800s entering service from May 2019, HSTs bowing out of service in December of the same year, while the expectation was that the InterCity 225s would be retired by June 2020, although in the end, LNER announced that they would be retaining a limited number of sets to deliver all of the benefits of their December 2021 timetable. All sets are now allocated to services between Leeds, Newcastle and King's Cross, with the last operation of InterCity 225s north of Newcastle being on September 7, 2020. LNER now maintaining a fleet of 12 Class 91s as of 2023, all of which, with the exception of a few special liveries, are now painted in a revised revival of the InterCity Swallow livery that replaces the traditional graphite grey with oxblood red. Aside from those currently surviving in LNER service, 13 examples have been scrapped, the first of which was the cursed 91132 that was broken up at Sims Beeston in March 2021, while 5 remain in storage, and 91131, the last locomotive to be built at the famous Crewe Works in Cheshire, has officially been preserved at the Museum of Scottish Railways. Potential further uses for the Class 91s include a possible scheme to see these machines take up the mixed-use role they were originally intended for when built back in the late 1980s, with 91117 and 91120 being leased to Europhoenix, where they were to be re-geared for heavy freight use on the export market in continental Europe, though this project never came to pass, and the locomotives were returned to storage. Meanwhile, 2 Class 91s, 91122 and 91128, were reactivated after withdrawal in order to conduct testing of the overhead wires for the extended electrification of the Midland Main Line between Bedford and Market Harborough, with both units being scrapped after the testing was completed. Another prospective user being Grand Union, a tentative open-access rail operator that proposes the use of the InterCity 225 sets on London Paddington to Cardiff Central and London Euston to Stirling services. Today, the surviving Class 91s have racked up many millions of miles in dedicated East Coast service, and while the future of these somewhat bespoke engines is very limited, and their long-term use with LNER not guaranteed beyond the middle of the decade, these trains, together with their Mark IV sets, have proven to be a highly successful last hurrah for loco-hauled operations on the East Coast Main Line.